And good morning. Welcome to the National Tropical Weather Conference live casts brought to you by USAA, South Padre Island Convention and Tourist Bureau, and Plylock's Hurricane Clips. These programs are a team effort between Bill Reed and Tim Smith. Here is Mr. Tim Smith, Chief Meteorologist over at KRGV in the Valley. Tim.
Thank you, Alex, and good morning, everybody, on this beautiful Thursday morning. The good news is temperatures here got down below 85 last night. Bill may not have the same story to tell in a second here in Houston, so we'll take it when we can get it. Again, as Alex mentioned, our sponsors, we truly appreciate all they do for us. USAA Plylocks, if you don't know them, they look like this. They go on plywood. You just slide that into the window this way. When the hurricane's over, you pull it out and protects your windows during the storm. That's a big thing. And of course, South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau, they are open and doing things the right way in South Padre Island. The crowd has gone away now. School has started again, so it's a quiet time on the beach, and it's very easy to socially distance out there right now. So it's a great place to be. Tropics are still active, and a lot going on, not only in our basin, but on the other side of the world as well. Let's get an update now and then get an introduction of our speaker from Mr. Bill Reed. Good morning, Bill.
Morning, Tim. And yeah, low in Galveston was 87. Low up here at my house is about 82, which is a couple degrees cooler than yesterday. And at dew point was a little lower, but that's just summer in the Gulf Coast. It happens like that sometimes. So let me pull up my screen here. I need you to enable, Alex. Funny, we do that all the time. Okay.
Yep, you got it.
And let's see what comes up here. And I'll get start with what's going on in our world. Nana made landfall. It reached hurricane intensity just before reaching Belize. It's going to pretty much die over the mountainous terrain of Guatemala and southern Mexico. And the models are no longer indicating any development after it gets in the Pacific. Omar is still hanging on as a depression. Doesn't look like anything on satellite, as I'll show you in a minute. Is forecast to become a post-tropical cyclone soon, if not already. Now that I light up the 5-day, we get all kinds of activity going on. Furthest east, a new tropical wave that we were looking at yesterday over Africa is supposed to emerge over the weekend into the Atlantic, and we'll bear watching. This little swirl down in the central Atlantic is hanging on there, and they've upped the ante to 40% on it developing. And the big red area is a complex system that's going to get its act together early next week in the central Atlantic. The important thing to note is steering is somewhat slow now compared to last week, and nothing in the next 5 days looks to be approaching any land in the Western Hemisphere from these systems, nor are they looking at anything in the Caribbean or Gulf forming in that time frame. Quick look at the satellite. You can see a much more interesting convective ball in the Gulf of Tehuantepec, and this is the tropical storm Omar plowing into the mountains of Guatemala. Still a lot of convection over the Caribbean. It'll be moving into the Gulf and maybe into Texas about the time that front gets here next week. Give us a good rain, which many of us need. Go out further east, you can see that this is the little swirl that's one of the outlooked areas. And here's the big area of actually two waves that are kind of going to merge and become the system up here early next week. Meanwhile, in the Western Pacific, there's been kind of a crazy week for South Korea. They had a storm go just up their west coast a week ago and make landfall in North Korea, a fairly rare event on its own. Yesterday, Masak made landfall as a typhoon near their second largest city over here on the south coast. And this baby here, Haishen, I think is how they pronounce it, is forecast to become a super typhoon while it's approaching the Ryukyu Islands, then weaken steadily as it again approaches a landfall in the same general area as Masak 4 or 5 days from now. Their record is already tied for landfalls in a season. They average one, they've had 4. So if this occurs, it'll be a record active season for them. Landfalls seem to be the rule these days. a little more tight thing. It still hasn't fully developed a solid eye wall feature there, but it's obviously been intensifying through the last 24 hours from tropical storm to now typhoon strength. And I think I have one more, if I can find it. Nope. That's all I got. Okay, I'm going to stop the share here and introduce our next speaker. Brian's going to be speaking to us from Miami. He was with us last week when we were talking about Laura. Born and raised in my neck of the woods up in Reading, Pennsylvania, and like me, got out of there as soon as he was eligible. And he had his an undergraduate degree from Lycoming College in Williamsport, where physics and astronomy were his interest. Then went on to graduate school where he got an MS in atmospheric science at Colorado State. Spent the next 10 years working at CSU's Department of Atmospheric Science, conducting research. He now maintains a blog on tropical cyclone activity for Washington Post Capital Weather Gang that many of us follow on Facebook in general around here. And since 2012, he's been a senior research associate at the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Sciences. Another paradise, but very different than CSU. So Brian, it's all yours.
Thanks, Bill, and good morning, everyone. So I think there's a few things that have been going on of interest in the tropics, and one of them kind of came up last week regarding Marco and Laura. There was chance, so the models were indicating that at some point they could get close enough to each other in the Gulf of Mexico to actually sense each other's presence and kind of interact with each other. Turns out that never really happened. It was close, actually, but things just weren't quite right, so it didn't work out. But it does happen. This is a very real thing, that hurricanes or typhoons in other parts of the world, they can get close enough to actually nudge each other's tracks or kind of rotate around each other, around a common center in between them. And in the most extreme cases, they can merge. And these things happen in nature, most commonly in the Western Pacific, but it's also been observed in the Eastern Pacific and Atlantic. So there's nothing special about any area in the world. Just some parts of the world get more storms to begin with, so their odds are higher. So with Marco and Laura kind of out of the picture now, and we didn't get to see that happen, I'm going to kind of bring this up and relate it to what you just talked about, Bill, with that mess in the Eastern Atlantic. There are 3-ish areas, waves, we call them, that are all things that come off every few days and just march across the deep tropics, one after another from August, September, October. But sometimes things get a little weird, and that doesn't happen quite like what we picture in our mind of some just a sequence of waves. Some of them become hurricanes, some of them don't, whatever. This is kind of an odd thing that in the last week or so, the flow out there has kind of slowed down. And so the waves that came off, the first one that you showed, the furthest west one, that has hardly even moved in the last few days. Meanwhile, the ones coming up from behind it are still moving and are going to catch up to it, but they're slowing down. And then the one behind that is doing the same thing. It's going to come up and kind of catch up with those two. So you're going to have 3 of these waves, none of which might actually be, named or numbered storms yet, but just waves, kind of very weak low pressure systems. And a lot of models are suggesting that these three waves, or if two of them interact first and then the third one catches up. It's hard to say at this point, but at any rate, some number of these waves will meet and mingle out there in the Eastern Atlantic. And by meet and mingle, I would say some of them could get close enough to just affect each other's track, where you have two of them coming and they kind of do a swirl around each other, but keep on going. But it's also not out of the question at all that one could merge with another completely, and then you end up with two. And then in the extreme case, let's say the easternmost one catches up with that, and then those merge, and you're left with one thing out of the three weak things now. And it's kind of interesting because it doesn't necessarily always mean you're just going to get something larger and stronger. I think that I saw that in some of the news stories with Laura and Marco, that you're going to merge Marco and Laura and come up with this ultracane. It's just not how it works. They tend to influence each other, not in a great way, typically for them. Granted, one of them might win the merger or the interaction, but usually not without a lot of wounds in the process. So you don't just get a hurricane plus a hurricane and get 2 times the strength of that hurricane. You'll usually end up with, one won't exist anymore, and one will be a weakened hurricane, that sort of thing. In this case, we're talking about weak things to start with, just waves. And so there's not a lot to be gained or lost, really. To have a weak wave merge with another weak wave, not a big deal. If anything, it could actually work to enhance them a little bit, because they're not an organized system yet. You can't really lose much. You can either stay the same or gain at this point, right? So I think that's going to be really interesting to watch over these next few days to a week or so. So that mess that you showed, Bill, on that map, where there's 3 areas. I think there was a yellow, an orange, and a red one for low probability, medium, and high of becoming a tropical cyclone in the next 5 days. And the zones of where they could form were practically stacked on top of each other. It's a really complicated thing that could happen in these next few days. So in 1 week from now. I'll kind of break there, because I think if anyone wants to bring up a question or chat about this, let's do that.
Cool. Yeah, I was looking at the satellite. You still have a fast-moving easterly jet, the low-level jet in there, and it's bringing these waves. They come marching off of Africa at 15 to 20 miles an hour, and they all jam up, a traffic jam, so to speak, in that same spot. And I don't know, I didn't see a clear signal on how long that slow pattern would last out there, but at least a week.
Yeah. And that's exactly what's happening, is these things are coming off just fine, and somewhere maybe halfway between the Lesser Antilles and Africa, they kind of lose all their steam, and even further east than that. But that's kind of like the westernmost point, where things just gradually drift to a stop and wait for someone else to catch up to them.
Yeah.
Can you recall a time when we've seen storms tripping over each other like this? I mean, I don't recall seeing 3 yellow, orange, and red circles on top of each other. That's pretty unusual.
Nothing specifically comes to mind for me. I mean, I'm sure it's happened, that this sort of thing happens where you might have waves come off one further north latitude and one a little bit further south. So the odds are that if they're moving both this way, they might not be moving at exactly the same speed. So you'll have one overtake the other and maybe merge or rotate around a common center. But having 3 of them with this potential interaction in a few days is, I'm not going to call it unprecedented, but I will say it's rare. Yeah, I don't know, Bill.
I'm not good at remembering year to year or those kind of things, so I'm not aware of any at that. Might have to get a hold of Jack Bevan. He's got a photographic mind for the historical stuff.
He does.
Another on the Fujiwara, after we had talked a little last week, I was talking with somebody else and looking at some pictures. The interaction during the perfect storm of this gargantuan extratropical low south of the Canadian Maritimes and east of New England, and a Hurricane Gladys that looked like a blip, a little small item, but it was an average size hurricane. It literally, it started to do the Fujiwara with it, but it very quickly got absorbed by the extratropical low.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point with all of this is the Fujiwara effect. And just as an aside, it's named after Fujiwara, of course, from a paper he published in 1921. That's kind of when this was first observed, and it wasn't observed in hurricanes or the weather at all. He did it just in a tank. So it was just a really idealized lab experiment. And he noticed when two vortices of like signs, so two low pressure systems, for example, get close enough to each other, they start to influence each other or even merge. So anyway, that's kind of the long history. That we're almost at 100 years since he published that paper. But there's a few things that matter. So it's not just you have these two low pressure systems that when they get some number of miles apart, they're going to do something. It's not that simple. It depends on how large they each are, how strong they each are, if there's any external forces acting. If you just have two hurricanes sitting in a perfectly isolated world, that's going to act differently than like your example of something up by New England, where you have very strong mid-latitude forcing and winds and everything like that. So with all these, there's not really a rule of if this wave and this wave, or this hurricane and this hurricane are this far apart, then this will happen. There are general guidelines, like for waves, it's got to be a lot closer because they're so weak. It would take a lot for them to feel each other, basically. But for hurricanes, we tend to think of an interaction being possible kind of in the 800 to 900 mile ballpark. So if they're about 800 or 900 miles apart, you might start to see them in a centroid relative, which means you find the point between them, and they would orbit around that common center. And it takes, this isn't something that you're going to see in a few hours. It takes days for these things to gradually orbit around a common center. But, if you have 5 or 6 days to watch hurricanes, like we sometimes do, it happens, and it's been observed. But when you, again, using kind of an average, you get into maybe the 400 to 500 mile range, then you start getting some of the more interesting things happen. For sure, they're going to be affecting each other with wind shear and things like that, because they both have their own outflows and circulations. But that's where they start to have this mutual attraction when you get that close. And at that point, they could either come close enough to really whip around each other, where you come closer, 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 and then do that sort of thing. Or in the extreme case, again, they could actually merge, where you get closer and closer. You're rotating around this common center, and they get closer every rotation around, and eventually there's only one thing left.
We've got a good question coming in from Casper. He says, if the vortices decide to rotate around themselves, could this end up similar to the broad area of low pressure circulation with multiple LLCs we saw in Isaias?
Okay. So this is a kind of a scale. Yes, I'd say in general. So what we saw there, and we do tend to see in weak to moderate tropical storms, is there's not yet a single coherent center. They kind of struggle to find themselves for a little while. So it's not crazy that, it's hard to find a center. And especially when you're a forecaster having to locate a center in real time and you don't have the advantage of hindsight, you don't always know which center is going to actually end up being the proper center. So you'll sometimes see what we saw with Laura and Isaias, where there appears to be kind of a jump in the track now and then. It's because there was a center, and then you're like, well, okay, that's not the center that we were tracking before. Now it's here, and that happens. But yeah, let's say you have a weak to moderate tropical storm with 2 or 3 kind of centers, either low-level or mid-level centers, and it's kind of hard to tell at the time which is the real one or which one will win. The same exact process can happen inside of something like that, where they could actually orbit around each other, around some common center again, or you can have some of them merge. That happens for sure in these weak systems. So yeah, it's the same process for the same reasons that you can have these kind of ugly multiple mid-level centers in weak storms that eventually become one.
Is the Gulf of Mexico big enough for real Fujiwara? Somebody, they were talking about a dance between Laura and Marco. It's going to be a dance, and it's like dancing in a closet. There's not a lot of room to work, but it's still a pretty good sized body of water. Can they interact in a body of water that size?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say yes, in principle. There is enough room to, again, using maybe Laura and Marco, but even ones that are further apart, that there could be enough room to maybe 1 or 2 days of interaction. So not enough for a merger or anything like that. If you have a tropical storm and a hurricane on their ends of the Gulf, and they start to come toward each other, like we saw with Marco and Laura, it's not at all impossible that those two, had they been a day closer, something like that, that we would have seen them start to orbit around a common center, which, again, you're not going to visually be able to watch them do this. But to us, what it would have appeared like is, instead of a track following a very natural curve or very natural line into a coastline, it would do something strange and have a kink in it or something like that, or a more abrupt turn. And that would have been a sign that they probably nudged each other at some point. But to do a full mutual orbit and merger, I don't think the Gulf is large enough.
Go ahead, Bill. I'm just going to some of the questions online. Go ahead, jump in.
Well, if it's going to happen, it'd be this year, of course, 2020. And thinking back to that first question about the vortices, yet to develop a center on there, the Fujiwara the distance is that nominal 800 or 900 miles is probably based on the average size of an average tropical cyclone.
Yeah.
So conceivably, we could get 2 very small storms like Umberto 10 or 15 years ago, and another one in near proximity in the Gulf and have it. But that's pretty rare. It was pretty rare anyway to have Laura and Marco at the same time that close to each other. So it's just not something we're going to see every day. So earlier, before we got on the air, you were asked an intriguing question concerning the activity this season, the number of storms versus the ACE. Where do you think we're at on that? And do you have any insight on how it might all play out over the next 8 weeks?
And define ACE for the people that are watching who may not know what that is.
Sure.
Accumulated energy, but I'll let Brian give you the technical words on that.
Okay, sure. So ACE is the accumulated cyclone energy, and it's actually independent of the number of storms, but it can be calculated by taking whatever the intensity is of some storm, at least of tropical storm intensity. So tropical storm on up to Category 5, whatever, but not any depressions or anything like that. So you take the intensity at some advisory time, square that, and then add all those up for every storm every 6 hours. So you can have like a very strong hurricane in 6 hours will generate a lot of ACE, while a minimal tropical storm in that same 6 hours will generate much, much, much less. But you think over the lifetime of a storm, you could have a Category 1 hurricane that lasts for a week and a half, and it could generate as much ACE as a short-lived, stronger hurricane. So it's kind of a way, it's a metric that combines the longevity and intensity, but doesn't actually care about how many storms went into it. So you could easily have a hurricane season with more ACE, but fewer storms, fewer hurricanes. That's completely within the realm of reality. And that's kind of where we're at. So we've had 15 named storms now already. It's September 3rd. Some seasons never even reach the O storm ever. And we're there just getting into the peak of the season. So that said, 6 of those 15 has lasted for 2 days or less. So kind of, we've had a lot of really short-lived things. So in terms of ACE, we are above average right now, about 125%, so 25% more than what an average season would be. But for having 15 named storms by September 3rd, that's not very high. You would expect it to be much, much higher. For example, in terms of named storms, we're running just about a week or so ahead of 2005, which was an outrageous season by any metric. So we're kind of ahead of 2005's pace for named storms. But in terms of ACE, it's much lower than 2005's. It's not even, I mean, it's less than half. So although we're getting a lot of storms, they're not adding up to much in terms of activity. So what does that mean? I mean, I think at this point, I would say it's extremely likely that we will wrap up the rest of the 6 letters in the normal list. And just like in 2005, head into the Greek alphabet, which is what we use after the regular lists are exhausted. There's 21 names in a regular list because some of the letters aren't used because there's just not a lot of names that start with them. And so, yeah, like in 2005, we got into the Greek alphabet. I don't even remember now, probably by 6 or 7 storms or something like that. I don't know if that will happen this year, get that far, because that lasted into December, if I'm not mistaken. We actually were still getting named storms postseason. But given that there's only 6 names left and it's September 3rd, I would say there's a very high likelihood that we'll be speaking Greek and probably by the month's end.
Claude would like to know if, do you think the Texas Gulf Coast could be threatened again this season?
Well, I would say yes. Just because I'm not going to say no. No, there's no reason to think that it would not be. So I'm not going to say, okay, Texas, you're off the hook now. No, I think we definitely still need to be paying close attention to things. Whether you're in Florida, where I am, or Texas, where you guys are, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I agree. I think if they get I could easily foresee a break in the high pressure and a relaxing of the westerlies a little bit early October to where something could come out of the Caribbean and still come west rather than go into the East Gulf.
Yeah. And here in South Florida, October is actually when we get most of our hurricanes. You look back through history and we've gotten more hurricanes during October than any other month. So it's a hard message to get across because by then I mean, well, June starts, and there's a lot of the talk about hurricane season and everything, but it's usually pretty quiet the first 2 months. August and September obviously really ramp up, and we've certainly had some infamous storms in August and September here. So that's and same for you guys in Texas. But in terms of just how many hurricanes, we've actually gotten more in October than in August or September here.
Yeah, you're kind of the steering pattern gets a lot more like June, early July, where you start getting westerlies impinging on the subtropical high and give it a south to north flow that extends from the eastern or the western Caribbean up into Florida and the extreme eastern Gulf of Mexico. But you got a lot more heat involved in the ocean content. It's at its maximum come October.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of shifts too, because we tend to think of the strong hurricanes coming from the southeast or the east, coming across the deep tropics, and they just whack South Florida straight in off the ocean. But in October, that's when you tend to get fewer of these Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico and coming from the south or the southwest into Florida. And, so the whole vibe of it changes of, okay, we tend to lose our attention looking over far east by October. I mean, you can still get some activity coming from there, but that's when the Caribbean starts to cook.
Yeah, I'd love to be able to recreate the upper air charts for North America in the late 1800s. There's a lot of historical tracks that come out of the Caribbean and then bend back to the east and hit west coast of Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And they've had relatively little activity since then.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You got a viewer that would like to know how hurricane modeling has changed in the last 10 years.
Well, I can answer. I don't know. Bill probably has some insights too. I'll share some, and I think most of the improvements in forecasting have been in things like the HWRF and HMON models, which are regional hurricane-specific models. They're only run on tropical cyclones, so the rest of the year and the rest of the time they don't even run those. But they're pretty high-resolution models, and 10 years ago they were, sometimes they were the brunt of a lot of jokes, I guess is the kind way to put it. They've really done some amazing things, though, in the last 10 years in terms of how the models are initialized, how they handle trickier environments like shear and land. There's obviously still some issues, but that's never going to go away. But I think they are really advancing pretty far in that regard. And the other thing that tends to help more for the intensity problem, having these improving regional high resolution models. For track, I think we have and will see more gains as the more coarse resolution global models can run more ensemble members at higher resolution. So typically you'll have one of these models run at relatively high resolution, a single run, and that's kind of the answer that you'll usually see in some of the internet sites and things of this is what the GFS model is doing. That's its one high resolution run. But the European, the GFS, all those, they also run in ensemble, where you tweak the initial conditions a little bit. Maybe in the case of the GFS, 20 times, in the case of the European, 50 times. You just add little bits of uncertainty right at the start and then run it just like all the others. But those little bits of uncertainty at the beginning propagate into uncertainty and spread after 2 days, 4 days, 6 days, 10 days. Of course, and then at some point it just becomes useless noise. But with time, as these different agencies are able to run more and higher resolution ensemble members, there's a lot of use in running those and being able to interpret those. So you're not just stuck with one answer from one model. You're stuck with, there's the 60% chance of this outcome, and if it does that, it'll be the stronger storm. 20% chance that it could actually recurve and do this. I mean, that's really useful information. We have seen that evolve in 10 years. I think that the ensembles are becoming more skillful for track. So, Bill, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, a couple of things. The first hurricane dynamic models that Dr. Bob Sheets was involved in implementing, the global models that he had to initiate the nest were on the order of 150 kilometers. So and it was strictly a problem of computing power. So even 10 years ago, we've probably, it's either by a half or a third that we've reduced the grid scale in both the European and GFS models in there. That and the computing power allows for tweaking of the physics. They get closer and closer to reality on that. And I think the remote sensing, the pioneering stuff of these small satellites that can be put up in large masses, that'll become a data source in the future to even get higher resolution. Because you reach a point where you can compute it down to a smaller scale, but if you don't have the data commensurate with that scale to initialize it with, you're introducing a lot of error. That's probably because I'm an old guy, but I have yet to find much use as an operational forecaster with the other than looking at the ensemble mean, of even looking at the ensembles. The spread on most of them is greater than the spread on the tracker models, and doesn't verify. It verifies better on the deterministic runs when you look at it still at the end of the year by quite a bit usually. The only thing that's somewhat of utility on that's the ensemble mean. And Laura will be a good one to look at, that the ensembles were all over the place. And fortunately, the deterministics prevailed and we had a good forecast.
Yeah. I think even for messaging to the public, there's not that the public needs to understand what the ensembles are and what the output even looked like, but in the messaging that, say, the HurricaneCenter or folks on TV might do, is it gives an indication of how confident the forecast is. So if you run these ensembles and they're all really tightly clustered, that's in great contrast to the same scenario where you run the ensemble and there's like a squash spider effect, basically, where they're all over the place in 5 or 6 days. And both of those things can happen, and it speaks to how predictable the atmosphere is in the short term and up to a few days. And there are times where it's fairly predictable and things are pretty well behaved. And there's times where there's just a lot of tiny things that could make a big difference. And that's where you get those huge spreads in the ensembles. Is like, well, if this is just off by this much, you have a hurricane that goes into the Caribbean, or it turns north over the open ocean, something like that. So I think it's useful just in the messaging to say, this is the forecast. The HurricaneCenter only produces one forecast. You don't get the option to say, well, we're going to forecast this and this just in case the other thing happens. You have to pick one. But in the messaging, though, can be, the uncertainty is very high right now beyond day 3, that sort of thing, or there's high confidence in this forecast, that sort of thing, I think is useful for people.
Yeah, some great examples of what you just described. Yesterday's typhoon MASAC, most of its life, the ensembles were so close. Even the ECMWF with 50 members that was so close together, you couldn't pick out the individual lines. And they're going to verify quite well over South Korea. So obviously it was a pattern where stability of the flow was pretty good. And then I used the Irma example for your earlier point about they look real close for about 72 hours, and then all of a sudden it looks like a broken umbrella in there. And that's usually the case. More often than not, you get that than you get the tight all through 120. And I try to use that to convince people who are demanding that we have skill at days 6 and 7 and say, look, we don't really have stable skill at day 4 and 5. We can still have really large errors come out. I mean, there'll be some storms that behave, and that brings the average error down, and then you have some that really are off the charts, not even close to within the cone out there at those times. And until you see more and more cases where we're closing the gap on those ensembles out at the later time steps, I don't think we'll be able to give as skillful a forecast beyond that people want.
Yeah, that's a great point of how far out should people look at forecasts. The Hurricane Center currently goes out to 5 days, and they do the 7-day in-house. So I don't doubt that we'll be seeing that in a version that we can all see at some point in the coming years. You know, if that's what it is, that's what it is. But you have some of the other models that are run out for weeks and weeks. And you can flip through the output of that and see hurricane doing this in another 14 days, you know, whatever. Well, the thing is about a 6-hour forecast, a 12-hour forecast, 384-hour forecast. You could let it run out another month if you wanted to, if you have time on the computer. They don't care. The models have no interest in skill. All they're doing is crunching numbers. So just because there's these long range models, like the GFS forecast, I think goes out, or the version that we see is 384 hours. The European, again, the version that we see is 240 hours, which is 10 days. 10 days is marginal. I think there's, at least for large scale features, there can be some skill at 10 days. You wouldn't pay attention to where's a hurricane going to make landfall in 10 days. But if there's a bridge or a trough or something in 10 days, okay, I might go for that. But yeah, the really long range stuff, unfortunately, some people see that and just grab onto it, and they'll see this hurricane that's coming toward the East Coast in 14 or 15 days. And it's just, it's noise. That's about all I would call it.
Yeah, my advice to people is when they're looking that far out is to look at what's happening right now. If there's not an already present low or a decent enough disturbance that you can identify that the model is picking up on, be highly skeptical about what it gins up way out in time and then makes into a big hurricane, right? A lot of us affectionately call those model canes.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a thought, you know, as we talk about ACE and, you know, the season's so active, yet the ACE is so low. You know, to those of us in the meteorology world, we remember the numbers of storms there were, and that was an active season. This was inactive. But I think to the general public, a lot of times, the number of names that were retired kind of is a good benchmark because you remember those storms. You know, in 2005, we remember Dennis, Katrina, Rita, you know, remember Wilma. I don't remember Stan. It was retired. I don't remember much about Stan. But the others I remember, and we remember like that. And this season, I would say so far, I mean, Laura's probably the only name that stands a chance of being retired. And you know, we're still got a long way to go, but so far.
That goes into the landfall. It makes all the difference on what season's remembered for. 2010, 19 storms and I think 6 major hurricanes, none of which crashed in the land. People don't remember that season. It's one of the top 5 or 6 most active seasons in ACE.
Yeah, 2 storm names were retired that year, Igor and Tomas, and I don't remember either one. So I don't think they hit the U.S.
caused a lot of flooding deaths in Haiti and a couple other islands. And Igor, I think, is whacked to Canada. I may be wrong on that.
Probably Bermuda.
Bermuda.
I'm not sure either.
which tells you, that it's not a memorable season for even though it was a very busy season.
Well, I was over at the center then.
You probably remember more than I do then.
Like I said, not my forte. I would always go to someone like Bevan to find out. There's a event for Lixion. He had the Caribbean down cold.
Well, how about some final thoughts, Brian? Something you want to wrap with? Something you want to leave us with today?
I think maybe keeping on this ACE and activity topic is that we really are just about halfway-ish through hurricane season. The second week of September is the peak. We're just reaching that. So there's the whole second part of the peak and the ramp back down. So, we were talking about, well, it's not a lot of high impact storms yet, and the ACE is relatively low for the number of storms. So I guess the message would be to not have anyone come away with this of like, well, it's not that bad then. That there's plenty of time for some very serious action to still happen. So definitely don't let our guards down. We have September and October ahead of us, which this year, given the number of storms, if we kind of just play the odds game, if we're going to get quite a few more storms going, you only need 1 or 2 or even 3 of those to be strong hurricanes and hit land and make it a really, really bad season.
Yeah, Brian, we'll have to bring you back at the end of November and you can do a Paul Harvey thing. And now for the rest of the story.
Yeah.
So, Bill, any final thoughts? And I'll ask you a question before we go, Bill, and you can add your final thoughts in. Is if we get to the Greek alphabet and we have a major storm in the Greek alphabet, can we retire a Greek alphabet name? Can there never be another Hurricane Alpha?
Yeah, I'm sure we can. We'll have to come up with some other naming convention after a while because we're going to run out of names like the I's. There's not that many I names, and they're generally speaking, a lot of big storms are coming around the time of the year when the ice storms reached, and so we end up retiring a lot of them, and hopefully not Isaias. Everybody hates that name, but it was replaced on my watch, so I remember the discussion over that, and that was the exact same question. How's everybody going to learn how to pronounce that thing? And Lixion always said, "Oh, they'll learn. They'll complain, but they'll learn."
That was actually just a quick little story. That was a replacement from Ike, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, and then in 2014, we never got to the I storm even. The season ended with H.
Yep.
All right, Bill,
Brian,
final thoughts on your end?
great. Yeah, Brian, great to have you on again. I look forward to having you again, and somewhere down the road when all this COVID is done, we can all get together and hoist a few over in Miami.
That sounds like a great plan. Look forward to it, Bill.
All right. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Brian. Great show today. We appreciate it. Just a fun roundtable. Great information. So I hope
Tim. Yeah.
Hope the viewers appreciated it. If you have a question, if you're watching online, if you're watching a recorded version of this, type your question in and somebody will answer your question sometime shortly after that. If you're watching the next day or two, we'll get your questions answered. A lot of great shows coming up in the future. Alex, we got some good stuff coming.
Oh, yeah, we really do have some good stuff coming. Particularly next week, it's the anniversary show of the 1900 Galveston Hurricane. We've got Lou Fincher, Stan Blazek, Jody Gidley, and Chris Lancy. They'll all be with us next week, 10 a.m., September the 8th. That is a Tuesday. It's a little different for us, but we're doing it on the landfall of that 1900 hurricane. Again, don't forget our sponsors for our show. They make it possible here. USAA, South Padre Island Convention and Tourist Bureau, and Plylux Hurricane Clips. Don't forget to join us next week. And don't forget also, we do have our, podcast. It's Hurricane Center. You can find it on Apple Podcasts.